Hi guys, I thought I'd bring someone else with me to the lesson today because some of you might have wanted to see him, some of you might not care, but that's tough. So this is my son, this is Raphael. Say hello, Raph. Hello. And so he's the reason why I'm doing dad jokes at the moment, which the one for today is, you got to hand it to short people because they just can't reach it on their own. Yeah, another quality joke, right? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about secondary sources of information. Now, you'll be surprised to hear that secondary sources of information provide secondary data. So to begin with, I just wanted to recap the difference between primary and secondary data. Sociologists won't always use information data that they've gathered themselves. Often they will use information that other people or other bodies of people groups, whatever they might be, have put together. And that means that it's secondary data. So primary data is stuff that you've kind of gathered yourself. You've done the observation, you've done the interview, whatever it happens to be. And secondary data is stuff that other people have done that you then use for your research. And we're going to look at the two main types of sources of secondary data. And those are official statistics, so generally things put together by the government, statistics put together by the government, and documents. And we'll talk more about those when we get to them. So for now, the tasks is 6.1. Task 6.1 is to recap the difference between primary and secondary data / sources. So just give a definition of each, clearly stating what the difference is. Okay, so task 6.2 now. The first thing we're going to look at, the first secondary source of data we're going to look at is official statistics. And your task 6.2 is to write the description of that in the relevant box and then go through the strengths and weaknesses. So official statistics are generally a mass of information, a mass of quantitative data. And it's usually gathered by the national or local government. On a wide variety of things. Now, we've already used official statistics in a few areas that we've studied already. For example, in family, things like birth rates, death rates, marriage, all of that kind of stuff. That information comes from official statistics that is gathered by local or national government. In education, you'd think about like achievement statistics, and that's another kind of key area that we look at. And those statistics generally they're gathered by the government for the purpose of making policies. Okay, so family policies, education policies, whatever it happens to be. Next year we're going to look at crime, and so official statistics is a big part of the crime topic that we're going to look at. And there's some interesting things that we can say about it, but you need to have a background understanding of official statistics as we go forward. And so I want you to write the description of it, which I've just basically said, and then we'll move on to the strengths and weaknesses, and that's task 6.2. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the strengths of official statistics first, one of the biggest things, and the main reason why people would use them potentially, is because a lot of the work's already done for you. Okay, if you think about the fact that the government have gone out and gathered all of this data for you, it means that it's often free as well. So it's often cheap, if not free, a lot easier and a lot quicker. It's a lot less time consuming. So that's practically speaking one of the biggest appeals and strengths of using official statistics. Also, practically speaking, it could be that official statistics are the only source of information available on a particular topic. So that makes them useful as well. On that line as well, it's often the case that the government can kind of force and can compel people to provide this information. For example, it is a legal requirement that you register a birth. When I registered the birth of my son Raphael, I had 6 weeks in order to do that. And without that information, without that kind of legal compulsion, legal requirement, it's a lot harder. So, for example, when we talked about low response rate for questionnaires, that's not an issue here because the government have legally forced people to provide this information. One of the biggest strengths of it as well is because there's so much data from such a wide variety of participants, it's incredibly representative. If you think about like the national census that takes place every 10 years, that's hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people that are being surveyed, and so the data is incredibly representative. And it also means that we can compare data from all different people groups, so gender, ethnicity, class. We can compare this data for the different groups, and because they're always as well, they're often done on regular intervals. So it might be every year or every 10 years or whatever. It means that we can do kind of before and after studies. We can compare historical issues. So 50 years ago, what was divorce rates like compared to now? It allows us to do that, which would have been very difficult to do unless we had that information provided. So official statistics can be very useful in that regard. They're also really quite reliable. Okay, they're easily replicated. For example, death statistics, they are gathered in a standardized way so that it's always the same. There's a set procedure that has to happen when you're getting this information and processing this information that trained kind of government officials do. And that makes it incredibly reliable because it means, step by step, we can replicate it. Ethically speaking as well, what we've got is the fact that most of this data you can just go on the internet and find it. It's available to the public, which means most of the ethical issues aren't a factor. You don't have to worry about ethics here, so low risk of ethical issues with official statistics. And finally, then, the strength of it, we've got to talk about positivism. Now, I've noticed in some of the work that I've been getting that people don't have as secure a grasp of positivism and interpretivism as I would like. So once we've finished looking at all the different methods, I'm going to go and do a lesson on that. But for now, what you need to know is the idea that the positivists, they see this quantitative data that's provided by these different groups of or bodies of people like the government. They see them as facts. They see them as true and objective. So they're not influenced by individual people. They're completely kind of factual. And therefore, there's massive advantages that you can prove cause and effect relationships. And so the positivists find it incredibly valuable. If we flip over to the weaknesses, then interpretivists would say these aren't facts. These aren't objective. Someone's gone through a thought process and chosen what to include and what to not include. They're not objective. They're subjective. Okay, they've involved people's free will and decision making, which means that they're socially constructed. They are a creation of society. So we can't use them to prove cause and effect. Then they're not good for that because they're a social creation. So, one example is I talked about Durkheim's suicide study before. Now, interpretivists, they criticize that because they say what's going on is you haven't got a true and objective measure of how many people committed suicide. All you can really tell from those statistics is how many times a coroner decided to label a death as suicide. So for interpretivists, the only real use of official statistics is to work out what kind of or how often people were giving certain labels and what people what meanings people had in their heads for words like suicide or particular crimes. So they're not particularly valid for interpretivists. They're not really giving a true and accurate picture. Okay, and if we can look at the rest of the weaknesses for official statistics, practically speaking, the government will decide what they want to do the research on, what they want to gather data on. And it might be nothing to do with your research, it might not be anything that interests you as a sociologist. So the issue there is that, in a lot of ways, practically speaking, it's a very strong method, but it's only in certain areas, certain topics, that that's the case. And there might not be any data on your topic that you want. Also, a kind of theoretical issue is that the government may have a very different definition of what they're gathering data on compared to the sociologist. which creates issues of validity because it might be that, for example, let's give an example. For example, poverty. Okay, what counts as poverty might be very different in the government's mind compared to the sociologists. And so when they say, 10 million children are living in poverty, or whatever it happens to be, actually that might not be valid. That might not be a true and accurate representation of the real world, depending on what definition of poverty we're going to use. The other issue with that is that these definitions that the government can use will change over time. The government in the kind of last 30 years or so have changed what they mean by the word unemployment. And they changed it like several times. So it means that we can't necessarily have a valid picture, and we can't necessarily make the kind of before and after comparisons or comparisons with other groups, because the words might mean something different. The definitions might be something different. One of the biggest issues with official statistics is what's known as the dark figure. Now, for some areas, things like births and deaths, we could say that. That is highly valid. The accuracy, the truth or true representation that we get from the numbers of births and deaths, even though it's not 100% perfect, is still very, very close and therefore highly valid. But when we think about things like crime, there's lots of issues about validity there. Firstly, often these statistics are coming from what the police report or record. Okay, so the police, what they count as crime, that's the first step. Now, there might be lots of things that they don't bother recording. They might let people off with a warning. They might decide, actually, I've got more important things to do than waste my time dealing with this shoplifter because I'm on a murder case. So there's lots of crimes that might not get recorded at all. We then got the issue of all the crimes that the police don't even know about. Okay, it might be that, so when we look at crime, this is when we'll go into this a bit more depth, but one example is we look at who gets to, what the typical criminals like. But it might be that those are the only people that get caught. There might be tons of criminals out there that are just, that have very different kind of background and factors in the, socio-economic factors, who don't get caught at all, are really clever criminals, and so the police don't even know about them. So there's serious issues. Now that's called the dark figure of crime, is the number of crimes that basically just we don't know about. And that could be huge or it could be tiny. And this is the problem with it, is because we just don't know about it. It could be for every one crime that we know about, there's 50 crimes that we don't. Or it could be for every million crimes we know about, there's one that we don't. Big issues in validity for things like crime. But like I said, things like births and deaths, it depends what the content is. Things like births and deaths are pretty solid and pretty valid. Okay, that's the strengths and weaknesses. So task 6.2, you need to have completed the description of official statistics. I'm going to get fed up of saying that. And also then the strengths and weaknesses, and make sure you're highlighting whether it's a practical, ethical or theoretical, and if it's to do with validity or reliability or representativeness, make sure you're highlighting that too. Okay, we'll move on to documents once you've done that. Okay, so we're going to talk about documents now. So this will be task 6.3. It will be completing the kind of description and strengths and weaknesses of documents. Now, the word document can mean basically any written text, but there's a huge, massive range of different things that could come under the title of document, even though they might strictly not be a document, for the use of sociological research. Often they're things that are written, but it also can be visual things or acoustic things. So music or TV programs or photographs or paintings, anything like that can be included as documents and used as research. If you remember, think back to when we looked at childhood in the family topic, Aries, who was kind of describing the nature of childhood and how it had changed over time, used paintings from a few hundred years ago as part of his research to make a judgment about what childhood was like and how it had changed. So all of these different things count as documents. Now, the key thing that we need to do to distinguish between documents is talk about ones that are public documents and ones that are private documents. Now, a simple kind of way of distinguishing, simple definition, is public documents are things that are produced for use by the public. Okay, it's fairly straightforward and common sense. So that could be anything from like Ofsted reports to newspaper articles, all the way to Love Island. Yeah, these are things produced for public use, and therefore they count as a public document. We've then got the opposite side of that. We've got private documents, so things that are produced for private use. Okay, so that could be, often it's like diaries or letters, but it could be anything from bank statements to photo albums. And those are put together for private use, and so they're counted as private documents. So we need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of these. We're going to start with the weaknesses because it's slightly different than when we've talked about the other methods. Okay, so we're going to look at the weaknesses of using documents as secondary source of information, of data. But it goes slightly differently because there's a few checks that have to be done before a document can be used for research. And that's kind of forms the basis of the weaknesses that we're going to discuss. So the first check that has to be made is whether the document's authentic, whether it's real or whether it's a forgery or a fake. There was an incident in 1983 where suddenly some diaries got published that were supposed to be written by Hitler. And so, there's all kinds of issues with them, and they were made to make money, and they were sold for millions of pounds. But people would use them for research, and it turned out anyway they were fake. They were completely made up and written, weren't actually written by Hitler, so they weren't authentic. And that obviously affects the method. So in order to use a document, you have to check that it's authentic. That's the first step. The second step is something called credibility. Is it credible? Is it believable? Is it sincere? Is it genuine? Or is it completely biased? Or does it give a distorted view of the world? Is it something that was accurate? Was it written, a couple of hours after the event it happens to be describing? Was it written years after? And therefore, is it, as likely to be accurate? So there's a lot of different kind of aspects to do with credibility that you'd have to think through and check before you can say, do you know what, this is a document that can be useful for research. Another issue is representativeness. Is it a typical representation of life at the time? Or is it only showing the kind of, minority's viewpoint or minority's experience of life? A good example for this is, we talked about Airy's research on the paintings before looking at childhood. And it was criticism is very likely that the only people that would have been in paintings was the very rich. Your average child isn't likely to have been in a portrait. And so we can't say that research then is representative because it's only of a small group of society. And then the last kind of check that you need to do is on meaning. So does it still carry the same meaning that it had when it was produced? For example, when we talked about the word poverty, when we're looking at official statistics, has the meaning changed over time? There's a advert on TV at the moment for Made in Chelsea, which, by the way, you would have to pay me to watch, and it really annoys me. This is why it's becoming a part of this video. There's this really posh girl, upper class, well off, well to do, and there's this bit, and it really grates on me. She says, "Why are you all up in my grill?" And I think you're just an idiot. Anyway, we might know most viewers might know what that means. Why are you all up in my grill? And we might know what that means. But 200 years ago, they wouldn't have had a clue. And hopefully 200 years from now, they won't have a clue. So it might take some specialist skills like historical work to actually uncover the true meaning. It might even be that it's written in a foreign language or an old language, an old version of a language. And so again, it takes some specialist skills to uncover the true meaning. And you've really got to try and get at what the meaning was that the author or creator of the document was intending. And that then makes it much more valid if you can do that. And if you can't do that, then there's serious validity issues. Now, a final kind of issue, which isn't part of the checks, but is something that we always need to talk about, is the theoretical of positivism versus interpretivism. Now, on the weakness side, the people who aren't going to like documents and the use of documents are the positivists. And the reason is they're mainly a secondary source of qualitative data. And so that qualitative data, the positivists have no use for it. You can't prove cause and effect with it. It's not a social fact. It's just part of people's meanings and interpretations. And so it's no good. Having said that, there is a way that you can get quantitative data from documents, which is called content analysis. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, but you'll do that in a bit. But those are the kind of weaknesses of it. You've got to do all these checks to make sure everything's correct and accurate and right. Otherwise, you've got issues, and the document is likely to be very low in validity. Now, the strengths, there's not loads of these, so we'll get through them. But the strengths of documents. Firstly, practically speaking, the big advantage of secondary data and secondary sources is that it's generally very quick or very cheap to access and to get, because most of the work's been done for you. People have already gathered the data. So generally speaking, it's a easy or quick or cheap method to use. Although the qualitative nature of documents means that it would take a bit longer to analyse, most likely, than the quantitative nature of the official statistics. So you could, if you're doing an essay and discussing the differences between the two, you've got a distinction there that you could use as a kind of strength and weakness and a pairing link that would work really well in a discussion in an essay. And again, practically speaking, it may well be the only way of studying a particular thing, particularly when we're talking about the past or historical documents. Those might be the only documents that have survived, and therefore really it's our only insight, only way of investigating stuff that's happened a long time ago. Ethically speaking, again, you're a lot less likely to be at risk of ethical issues with secondary sources of information, unless you're going around stealing people's diaries. It's ethically sound. If you've come by the data, the document in an ethical way, then it's unlikely to pose any issues of deception, informed consent, whatever it happens to be. So ethically speaking, again, it's probably quite strong. And lastly, the fact that it's so rich in qualitative data, the fact that you really often, like diaries and letters and these kind of things, will really give an insight into the meanings and interpretations that people have and what they have in their heads. It means that interpretivists would love this kind of method. Okay, it's exactly what they're looking for, and they'd find it incredibly valuable because of that qualitative data and depth and deep detail that you would get, because they're often quite rich. So those are your strengths and weaknesses. So this task, you need to complete the definition and the strengths and weaknesses of documents. And then we're going to look at the content analysis, which will be the last thing that we'll do in this area. Okay, so the last thing we need to look at today is something called content analysis. Now, this is a way of analysing documents and using documents, but in order to get quantitative, say that properly, not qualitative data. Okay, and that's one of the key things. Now, vast majority of the time, content analysis is used on things produced by the media, so TV shows or adverts or newspaper articles, things like that, more than like diaries and letters and things like that. Although it can be used in both, but most of the time it's used on media productions or creations. And it basically works like this. You decide what you're going to investigate. So, for example, it could be the portrayal of women as housewives, mothers and housewives, rather than independent workers and things like that. You then define the categories you're going to use. when you analyze your sources. So it could be full-time employment, it could be full-time housewife, it could be part-time, bit of both, whatever. And then you study your source and note down, keep a log of how many times a character or something or someone fits the categories that you've defined. So if I was, to continue the example, you'd note down, if I watched a load of different TV shows or adverts, note down how many times a woman was portrayed as a full-time mother rather than in full-time paid employment. And then you can draw a conclusion from that quantitative data. Now, the strengths of this is that it's cheap. Okay, it's often the sources of data are easy to access. I mean, TV media, that it's relatively easy to access. And obviously positivists are fans of it because it's quantitative. So you can prove the cause and effect to a degree. It's trying to get at that social facts rather than interpretations. Weaknesses, it can be time consuming to do the analysis, and interpretativists argue, you're getting quantitative data, you're not getting the qualitative data, so there's not, you're not getting a lot of validity, you're not getting to the heart of the matter for them. So task 6.4 is to just write up what I've just said there about content analysis, brief description of what it is, how it's done, and the strengths and weaknesses. But then what I want you to do, task 6.5, I want you to actually carry out a content analysis. Now, this is something that can be done easily at home. I'm assuming most of you are going to use TV, but if you want to do like newspaper articles or internet news articles, that's fine. But I'm assuming most of you are going to use TV or film because that's what you're going to be watching anyway. And to be honest, pick something that that you like watching because you'd be watching it anyway. I'm not going to make you watch something that you don't particularly want to watch or don't enjoy because that isn't necessarily a good use of time. Now you need to pick a topic, so you could choose a topic. So, think about different TV shows that you watch maybe and think about, so could I look at portrayal of women? How many times are they portrayed as sexual objects, or how many times are they portrayed as powerful, independent, free from the oppression and dominion of men? Something like that. It could be to do with minorities, whether that's ethnicity or disability. How are those groups portrayed in particular TV shows? Or it could be to do with violence. You could do something on whether violence is kind of glorified, how often it's something that people kind of want to see or celebrate, or if it's treated in a negative way. You could do a comparison of like violence or content from 15 rated movies from 20 years ago compared to now. Is there significantly more kind of like sex and drugs and language and violence in movies today compared to 20 years ago, even though they're rated 15 still? Something like that. I mean, pick a topic, write up your categories so you know what you're looking for, make those categories as specific as possible. And it may be that as you're watching whatever it is that you need to add new categories. So if you're doing violence, you could, specific stabbing, kicking, punching, whatever it happens to be, have those categories ready. And then what I want as kind of evidence, you watch it, you draw your conclusion. Then what I want from you as actual evidence of task 6.5 that you've done this content analysis. I firstly want to know what it is you've investigated. So what's the topic? I want a list of the sources that you've analysed, whether you've watched or read newspaper articles or whatever it happens to be. But I want a list of those. And really, for it to be kind of useful, you've got to do more than just one or two TV shows. So I'm going to say that I want at least 5 sources for this. And then I want a written conclusion. So a paragraph summing up your research and what you've drawn from it. Now, because that's going to involve a reasonable amount of time, that's stuff you're potentially going to be doing anyway. I'm sure some of you, most of you are watching TV anyway. But what I'm going to do is say that the deadline isn't for the end of the week on Sunday. I'm going to say that I'll give you to the end of next week to get that done. So I'll give you a bit longer, basically. So tasks 6.1 to 6.4, the write-up of all of this stuff on secondary sources, I want that essentially by Sunday, but I want the actual content analysis that you're going to be carried out by the following Sunday, let's say. Okay, hopefully you enjoy that task. It's not often teachers will tell you to go and watch TV or movies or something like that. And I'll see you next time.